Welcome back to Ocala Talks on a Thursday. You know, in the early mornings of June 1st, 1921, a white mob marched across the train tracks in Tulsa, Oklahoma, into the predominantly black Greenwood district. If you know anything about the Black Wall Street incident, they brought firearms, gasoline, explosives. They raised the 35 square block area in Tulsa in a few hours. Award-winning author Brandy Colbert's Blackbirds in the Sky is a searing nonfiction account of the Tulsa Race Massacre. She joins us on the phone now to talk about this. Brandy, good morning to you.
Good morning, Tom.
You know, I have a master's degree in history, so I know a little more than what textbooks teach you. So I have an understanding of what happened on Black Wall Street in 1921. But for those that don't, talk about what happened that day.
Sure, and yeah, you certainly know more than most of us did up till recently. So the Tulsa Race Massacre occurred in 1921 over Memorial Day after a young black man named Dick Rowland was accused of assaulting a young white woman named Sarah Page. And he was arrested. He was taken to a jail cell at the top of the Tulsa County Courthouse to avoid a lynching. But a white mob gathered outside of the courthouse anyway, threatened to lynch him when black men from the Greenwood district, otherwise known as Black Wall Street, came over to try to stop the lynching. A scuffle ensued, a shot rang out from a gun, and then just chaos, erupted. And that's when the white mob marched across the train tracks and began, just essentially killing anyone they could find who was black and just working to destroy the entire neighborhood.
Why was that area referred to as Black Wall Street?
So it was a really, not completely unique of its time. There were other neighborhoods like this, sprinkled around the country. But it was a district that had been built up by black Americans themselves. And, there were a few white businesses there, but for the most part, everyone who lived there was black. Everyone who ran a business there was black. And, it was 35 square blocks of businesses and homes and churches and schools and just a really thriving community that had been, built up by black people alone.
Was Tulsa at the time a town that saw a lot of racial strife, or was this a surprise to the people at the time?
I don't think it would necessarily be a surprise to anyone who was paying attention. At the time, Tulsa was really racially segregated. Most of Oklahoma was at the time as well. And so one of the reasons that Black Wall Street was built up was because black people had been shut out of, the neighborhoods and opportunities that white Tulsans got to enjoy. And so, I think that there was a lot of tension between the two once some white people saw that black people were saying, well, we don't necessarily need you to build up our own wealth and build up our own neighborhood. There was some jealousy and some tension that intensified after that.
Can the seeds of this massacre, this senseless murder of people, can the seeds of it be traced all the way back to Reconstruction?
Oh, absolutely. Because as soon as black people got their freedom from being enslaved, there were people who wanted to take those freedoms away from them. And so, political gains were made and then were immediately shut down through laws that were passed. And that's one thing I really wanted to cover in the book was just how this did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because of all of the events, dating centuries before it that all came into play in 1921.
Where does the Tulsa Black Wall Street Massacre, where does it in the African American community, where does it sit as a historical bell tower to what the problems were that were faced by the African American community in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and some say even today? Where does that sit as one of the bell check marks of the constant degradation and murder that happened in the 20s and 30s and all? Where does it sit in the African American community as a historical event?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I don't think that even many black people knew about it until, fairly recently. I learned about it sometime in the last 5 to 10 years. But I think once you start looking at the Tulsa Race Massacre, you start seeing, and then other history, you start seeing that it wasn't necessarily unique, all around the country, in all the decades that you said, there has been black progress that has been squashed by, jealous white people, whether it was white mobs lynching, or just refusing to give black people opportunities to build up businesses like this. There have been so many instances like this around the country that certainly play into the story of black history as a whole.
I'm so glad you said around the country, because a lot of people give that moniker just to the Deep South or the 12 states that were part of the Civil War for the South. And this is an issue that was in urban areas in the Northeast, urban areas out west, all over the South. This was not just a regional issue. This was a countrywide issue, correct?
Absolutely, and that's one point I mentioned in the book, is that racism is often painted as a Southern problem, but it certainly was not. And you saw during the Great Migration, several, millions of black people moved away from the South and still experienced, rampant racism in the North, the Midwest, and even the West, too.
Do you think making sure that not only African Americans, but Americans all together know about these kind of events that may have not been as well known to the general public, do you think that will help bring everybody together? Or do you think that, like some pundits say, this is one of those things that is divisive? Why do we even need to talk about it? I understand why we need to talk about it, because history's good, bad, and ugly. You're not going to change it, so you need to learn from it. But what do you say to those people that say this is more of a divisive thing than it is a bringing the country to get back together thing?
Right. Well, I say they're wrong, because everybody, like you said, everybody deserves to know their history, whether it's good, bad, or, whatever it is, everybody deserves to know it. And so I think that the more we learn about our history, we can then put things into context in the past and draw those parallels to the present, and just hopefully stop that type of history from repeating itself.
That's the key to me, is we need to talk about it no matter how ugly it is, how good it is, how bad it is. It needs to be discussed, it needs to be taught, and it needs to be done properly so that we don't do it again. A lot of people say that we need to teach critical race theory, and I disagree, and here's why. I think we need to teach complete history. If you teach complete history, critical race theory will be covered, because complete history is the history of white America, black America, Asian American, Hispanic America. It's the history of America, no matter what the color is. And once we teach history that way, everything gets covered that way, to me. Am I wrong in that thought process?
I don't know enough about critical race theory to really give a very informed, definition of it. But I agree with you in that I think all history should be taught. And I think that, everyone's history deserves to be out there. So I think that it's really helpful when we think of Black history. Yes, we call out Black history what it is. It's history about Black Americans, but we need to make sure that we understand Black history is also American history.
I couldn't agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. Tell people where they can go find this book. Is it at all the retailers? Can you get it on the online stores? Tell people how they can find this.
Sure, yeah. It's available wherever books are sold, and there are signed copies available at several independent bookstores around the country. So I always suggest supporting your independent bookstore whenever you can. But if you can't do that, then you can buy it at online retailers as well.
Brandy Colbert's Blackbirds in the Sky. It's a searing nonfiction account of the Tulsa Race Massacre that took place June 1st, 1921. Brandy, thanks so much for taking time out to talk with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll be right back after this short time out to wrap up a Thursday edition of Ocala Talks right here on 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, WOCA. The Source.